So Craig, back to you. How does a company decide which structure is best to select? And we covered it a little bit, but you can maybe get a little deeper. And then if their needs and activities change in the future, which they likely will, how do they change that structure? And then just to kind of add on to that, like we all hear Delaware, right? What does that mean? Tell us a little about that too. So,
sure. Choosing which entity or which type of business to form. The first question is how many people are going to own the business. If it's just one person to start out, then your choices are sole proprietor, LLC, or corporation. So you don't want to use a sole proprietorship. While it's easy, it's you don't want to be personally guaranteeing everything to do with the business. So that leaves LLC or corporation. I usually go with LLC because if you're a single member LLC, for tax purposes, you're still a sole proprietor. You don't have a separate tax return. It's the simplest way to do it. Bret will tell you that it's on Schedule C of your tax return rather than having a separate tax return. But you have that limited liability protection. And you also have a separate entity. So if you add investors later on, you can do that with an LLC. You can also do that with a corporation. But I like having tax as a sole proprietorship if it's just you in the beginning. It's easier to deduct losses if you are, if you don't make money, and most startups don't start out making a lot of money. I also don't usually pay a lot of attention to taxes when we're initially forming, because you can always start small and change the type of entity later. And if you're losing money or if you're making a few $1,000s, whether the tax rate is 21% or 29% on a couple $1,000s doesn't make it as much of a difference as it will later on. Now, if you start out with a single member LLC, you can always go into a C corporation or an S corporation later on. You can add members and have a multiple member LLC. So you've got a lot of flexibility, and it's not that difficult to change. Now, if you've got more than one equity investor, more than one founder involved, then you can't be a sole proprietor because there's more than one of you. You don't want to be a general partnership for the same reason you don't want to be a sole proprietor, only even more. You don't want to personally guarantee not only what you're doing, but what your partner is doing. So with a limited liability company or with a corporation, you've got limited liability in most circumstances. I say most because there are certain things where you're still going to be personally responsible whether you want to or not. If you sign a lease, probably your landlord is going to want a personal guarantee. If you have employment taxes, chances are you're going to be personally responsible for those if those don't get paid. Sales taxes, you'll be likely personally responsible for those if those don't get paid. So I say in most cases you have limited liability, but don't count on that as being an absolute. So then the choice is LLC or corporation. Again, it's easier to go from an LLC taxed as a partnership into a corporation, or to make an election to have that entity taxed as a corporation. So I like to start with something flexible and easy to get out of, and then if you want to get more complex later, you can certainly do that. To the Delaware question, a lot of people in startups say, well, I hear I need a Delaware corporation, because the big companies in the Fortune 500, a lot of those are Delaware corporations. And if you talk to VCs, they say, oh, we only like to invest in Delaware corporations. And I think it's somewhat true, but probably a bit overblown. If you're an initial startup and you form a Delaware corporation, the annual fee to the state of Delaware and the fee you pay to an agent to represent you in Delaware are going to probably be around $4,000 a year. If you form an entity in the state of Ohio, it's $99 up front and then nothing after that unless you do something different. So you can save probably $4,000 a year. If it takes you 3 years to get to the point where you're going to have a VC come in and that VC insists on a Delaware corporation, then you've saved 12 grand through your startup phase. And I want to mention this really delicately. Some startups aren't going to get to that phase where they need a VC. Either, hopefully you'll do really well and you won't need that money, or if not, maybe you won't do so well and you don't get to that point. I don't recommend forming a Delaware corporation from day one unless you've got a big money investor who just insists on it. You can always start out small and change later.
Right, so what would be the advantage to the Delaware Corp for those who don't know?
Well, Delaware Corporation, tax-wise, is the exact same as an Ohio corporation. I mean, the federal government doesn't care where you're incorporated. The advantage to a VC, or if you do a public offering, is that investors, savvy investors are kind of around the country are kind of familiar with Delaware. They know what Delaware law does. The Delaware courts are seen as sophisticated in dealing with corporate governance issues if you wind up in a lawsuit. So they're seen as more sophisticated and more maybe more predictable in how they're going to turn out than Ohio courts and Ohio law, but or Michigan as well. So it's sort of I guess it's kind of seen as the gold standard, but it's overkill for a small business and for most startup, even growing startups. You don't always need that.
Thank you.